Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And it's an interesting season here in Beverly right now. It's an election season on top of the budget season. And to better help us understand what's going on, we have with us Julie Flowers, President of the Chamber, the City Council. And this is TBR, and I'm George Binns. So, Julie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back on, George. It's always good to see you.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to routinely update the troops as to what's going on. And I guess we got some surprises in the budget this year, and the numbers keep changing. And one of the things that surprised me is looks like the revenue went up 5.38%. Which is more than the magic 2.5 that we're all depending on. And as I mentioned before we started recording, that I've been tracking the numbers on my house for a couple of years, and routinely my taxes go up 4.5% a year for the last 10 years. And I finally tumbled to the idea that, there's a thing called the assessment on the property. Mm-hmm. And this year my assessment went up 10%. So claiming that, we don't use the whole 2.5 is leaving something out. So looking at the budget, am I reading it right, or is that really what's going on, or what's the story?
Yeah, thank you. I think you're asking some really good questions that I'm guessing other folks who are looking at the budget or following along with the process, or like you, opening their property tax bill and seeing that it's more than a 2.5% increase, have the same question. So I'm glad you're raising it. I think to go to the 2.5% levy question first. Yeah. It's a great question. I often find myself in conversations about it with folks because truthfully, it's something that I didn't fully understand until I started being part of this municipal budget process, because the way that we talk about Proposition 2.5 in Massachusetts, which is a law that's designed to try to protect property owners, to set a levy limit for municipalities at an increase of property taxes at 2.5% each year, year over year, is a levy limit on the entire levy. That means the entire city's tax rate can't go up more than 2.5% in a given year. But what I think is confusing, you said it's leaving something out. I think what feels confusing is that you're absolutely right. It doesn't set the cap at 2.5% on individual properties. And so if there are particular areas of Beverly, neighborhoods of Beverly, and you mentioned your home assessment has gone up 10%. That is, if you're someone who wants to sell a home in your neighborhood, that's great news. If your home is assessing 10% higher, you can sell it for more money. But every time that homes in a neighborhood sell for more money, of course, the other properties raise in value. And that means that for folks who are not selling, their individual property tax could raise more than 2.5% because suddenly their property is assessing much higher. But in the aggregate, other properties are assessing lower or flat. Commercial properties have been assessing flat since COVID, really. So you've got some really big commercial properties that are assessing fairly flat. And so that's where you've got these fluctuations where the entire levy limit can't go over 2.5%. But you're absolutely right. Individual property owners, if their property is assessing higher, they're going to see that increase. So I think that feels both confusing and can feel also really shocking, for folks when you open your property tax bill. That's not a good feeling. And so I think that's the challenge of this particular market that we're in, where residential properties in Beverly are desirable. Folks want to move in. There's not as many on the market. And so that drives prices up. And as I said, that's great for folks looking to sell. It is harder on folks looking to stay. And I think that's really, it's part of the challenge.
Yeah. We get into some of these issues, I guess, and the other thing that's surprising is there was an article recently that there's a new guesstimate on what the renovations to City Hall are. And as I read the paper, it says that the cost is now guesstimated to be 27 million. So it's gone from 18 million to 25 to 34.8, and it's back down to something like 27. But in that 27, it doesn't include the purchase of the dollar store. So that's really 27 plus the dollar store, which was 7.3. So we're talking 32 million and change for the renovations of City Hall, and yet to be determined is where you're going to move the staff when you're renovating, because you can't renovate around them.
Sure, that's very true.
So these are all loose ends that's not in the budget, as I understand it. That's another assessment or another exercise the City Council has to go through to approve it or disapprove it or what.
Yes, it's true. It's a capital project, and so it's not directly a line item in the budget. Where it sort of shows up is we do have a line item in the budget that's our debt, and so you budget for debt as a municipality as well. And so one of the practices that Beverly has had is to try to make sure that we are. I know it sounds strange actually, because as individuals, we often seek to reduce our debt. We're always looking to reduce our debt. And municipalities don't want to carry more debt than they can reasonably handle. And if we were doing that, when our finances were being looked at, we would receive feedback, from the rating agencies that would say that your finances are out of balance. But municipalities do want to budget for some debt to be able to do these kind of capital projects. And so we do maintain this debt service line item in the budget, and things then rotate out of the debt service line item. For example, the elementary schools that were renovated in sequence, years back now, they've been steadily dropping out as those debts have been repaid. The police station is budgeted into that debt service, the new police station that was built. It will rotate out on a planned schedule. So I think that's the place where you somewhat do see the City Hall project at a $25 million estimate. And you mentioned 27, so I'll come back to that. But there's a debt service line that's built with capacity to try to hold over for City Hall to be done should the council approve it. Because you're also correct that just because the debt service budget has the capacity to take on the debt to do a project like the City Hall renovation, the question still will remain, will the City Council approve the funding to go forward with it? And then we would be paying back knowing that we had budgeted for that debt. The 27 million versus 25 that was being held over, you're absolutely right that is an increase after, it's a decrease after a bigger increase. You've been following along, so I know you know. So the project really had grown in scope. The team did go back and say to the architects and design team, that's too much. We've got to narrow. So this update we just got was our first update after we saw that much larger project with the proposal for what was scaled back, what felt closer to the original target. Some of the increase, I think, we can attribute to costs rising both for contract work and also for supplies. And so I think that's where we're seeing some of that. But I know the last time you and I talked, I was saying one thing this City Council iteration I think has done effectively is say to the mayor and the mayor's team, we want these regular updates. We don't want to come in at the end of a project like the library HVAC and suddenly hear, we heard it was being it's under design for this amount, and suddenly we're all the way at the end, you're asking for a vote, and we haven't been part of it. So this update, I think, was actually important because it does represent hearing more step-by-step updates. And we'll plan to have that team back in September so that we can get even a more concentrated update as we're moving towards what will be a public hearing. Anytime that we're spending the public's money like that, there'll be a public hearing, and then the council will vote. So you're right, it's both in the budget and not, but it is in that debt service. We've got the capacity. Whether we decide to do it will be a different question.
Well, the other question on the finances that used to be discussed quite often, haven't heard much on it lately, is that the unfunded liabilities for essentially retirement and various medical plans.
Yes.
Is that under control yet, or is that still in nebulous area?
I think it's both. Great question. Again, at most municipalities, you're thinking in one case about the OPEB trust, which is this ongoing liability that pretty much every municipality has, and everyone's OPEB trust amount sort of has outpaced what municipalities have been putting in. So the state had put some legislation in place or some guidelines that said, these have to be fully funded by a certain point. So since that time, I think even before that time, but we've been steadily working. There is a plan where we put a certain amount into those liabilities every year. So they remain not fully funded, but I would say also under control in the sense that we're really working towards being able to address those in a really responsible way.
So that comes out of the real estate tax. It's not something that's rolled into the debt.
Correct. Yeah, that's part of the
Yes.
portion of the budget.
So
yeah.
we're having to pay that off. And any thoughts on what the city wants to do with the dollar store that we own? Did that come up at all? Is there any?
It did. It came up a little bit when we were discussing, in the City Hall presentation.
Yeah.
I think it was a very brief, briefly touched on. There'll be a lot more conversation about that. You're right that when we, as a city, purchased the dollar store, we decided to purchase it, or the council approved that proposed purchase for two reasons, really, I think in the council's mind, certainly in mine. I guess I won't speak for all of my fellow councilors, but I think for me, it felt like we are going to make this purchase partially to preserve the downtown parking that's behind it. For a long time, Beverly residents and visitors had been using that lot. It seemed and felt like a city lot, but it really was always owned by the owner of the building at the time. Mm-hmm. And we had an agreement where we were allowed to use it. When the building was slated to be sold to a different private developer, the parking lot was going with it, and so they had plans to use those spaces for what they wanted the building used to be. And as you know, our downtown parking is somewhat at a premium. Yeah. And so it was partially a way of thinking about how could we preserve that parking as downtown parking, and then what would we do with the building? The initial thought about what would we do with the building, as you're alluding to, is we could put City Hall staff there while we renovate City Hall, if we approve that project. Of course, so there were a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of what ifs here.
Yeah.
But that was definitely part of my thinking that made a lot of sense. It's still downtown. You could, in theory, keep the City Hall staff together. So if you are a Beverly resident, you're basically going to almost the same spot you're used to. You're going to find all of the same City Hall services. What I understand has happened sort of along the way is that the Family Dollar building itself would need such build out or such attention to be able to house staff there, including some removal of asbestos and other. It's an older building, so the cost to even transfer the staff there was sort of getting exponentially higher. And that, as I understand, is part of the reason for the shift to maybe we would look around and look to rent and house them elsewhere. I think one of the reasons that feels like a lot of what ifs is until we really know we're doing the City Hall project, the city can't, the way that purchasing works for municipalities, we have to put out a request for proposal.
Yeah.
We'd have to do that even to rent the space. So I feel like there's all these things in this funny holding pattern, and that I think feels very hard for members of the public trying to follow it. And I think even for the council, it feels like sort of which domino do we move first to try to get a sense of the whole. So what with the Family Dollar building, what the mayor did say in our most recent meeting, and I think was reflected in the article that came out, is that the hope is that the mayor's team would be having a public meeting during the summer, potentially in July, I think, after the week of the 4th, so not the holiday week, for the public just to come and to offer input on what might be done with the Family Dollar building. Yeah. And I think what we would expect is that eventually we would put out an RFP of our own to sell the building.
Yeah.
What would become of it would be the question, but that in theory would bring some money back into the city as well.
Yeah. And sounds like you're having fun with this whole business.
I'm trying to decide if fun is the right word. I think so. I think
if it ain't fun, why are you doing it?
I was going to say, I think there are challenges, especially right now, to our budgeting process. We're not alone in that. Cities and towns across Massachusetts are feeling that, and so that part is not fun. I wish that we had the money to be able to do all the really good things that we want to do, but I think you're right that trying to work together and trying to work with residents and talk with folks like you That part is fun and really does feel like that's how we can keep working to, we ask the hard questions and we try to move our community forward together.
So you're having so much fun that you're running again, right?
That's true. I am running again. Yes.
So how's the campaign going?
So far, it's been good. It's been a positive experience. I've had a chance to be out speaking with voters. Nomination papers are still sort of an ongoing process, and so part of that is getting with voters and asking them to sign your papers, but also hearing what's on their mind. And most recently, I had a campaign kickoff the beginning of this month on the 9th, and another great chance just to be together with folks and share a little bit about my hopes for the term ahead should voters decide to send me back to the city council and hear from them.
What are you hearing from them as you go around knocking on doors?
I think the biggest topics or questions that people have, one, you already asked, people really do wonder about how does Proposition 2.5 work? How come my property taxes are higher than 2.5%? So that's a conversation that I think is very live. Should we try a 2.5 override is definitely a conversation I hear from people, which, that would be a ballot question. That would be something that voters ultimately, if we put one forward, voters would decide, do we want to override the 2.5% levy limit for this set amount of money? The way overrides work, I'm sure you know, but just for those following, the community decides ahead of time, what is the amount we're voting on and for what purpose?
Yeah.
So that's definitely been a question, I think largely driven by the fact that we see that in our budget, we want to be able to do more for our schools than our budget is allowing. We want to be able to do more for our roads and our sidewalks and to support our different city departments than our budget is allowing. And so one way communities increase revenue is to consider a 2.5 override. So that's a big topic I hear about. And roads and sidewalks, always, our infrastructure is always of concern because people walk out their door and that's right there. Your road, your sidewalk, the pothole, the tripping hazard on your sidewalk, that's real life every day.
Well, I think that's one of the things that's kind of irritating about it, that every time the city gets a little tight on funds, we'll just cut out some of the roads and sidewalk work. And this goes on year after year. And it never seems to be a time to catch up. And
it is a challenge, and you're right that one of the reasons that we feel, I think when we look around, we feel like, oh gosh, we're really behind, and we're always playing catch up. In recessions earlier in the 2000s, that was absolutely an area that was pulled back.
Yeah.
Because there's only so many areas you can pull back, and so that was one. So we've been going along trying to catch up, but you're right. It feels like a game of catch up. This year, that budget line item was reduced to zero in the operating budget. You're absolutely right. The plan for this year, and we just voted to approve it, was to take $3 million of free cash. And you and I have talked about how it's not really free cash, but it's the money that's available that went unspent in the budget, and designate that to go towards roads and sidewalks. So a $3 million investment is largely on par with where we've been budgeting. But you're right that anytime we remove something from the operating budget, it raises a question about what's the plan going forward, because free cash amounts vary. And so you can't depend on free cash to be the same every year.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that it's a pinch point. We're trying to sort of walk that balance right now, but that's definitely a concern for folks.
Yeah, the other question I've seen, had some discussion with candidates for, school committee, and they've been kicking around the idea of an override.
Yes.
So the school committee settles, the city settles, and there is increments going forward. Are they covered, or is that going to be a surprise next year or the year after?
They are covered, and I think if anyone who's been following our budget process, though, also heard at the beginning when the budget was presented, heard the council hear from our budget analysts, but also from the finance director that FY26 that we're looking at right now feels tight. There are some challenges to the budget. There were some places, roads and sidewalks, the vehicle replacement line item in the police budget was also reduced to zero with a plan to use free cash to replace police vehicles that are needed. The same for Department of Public Services. The vehicle line item was reduced with that plan. So there were some places to scale back. So anyone following heard that this year is tight, but FY27 right now looks tighter and potentially has what's called a structural deficit. So it doesn't mean that when we get there, we will land in a deficit, because we can be thinking about how we can cut back, or revenue increases like potentially a 2.5 override. But so I think, to your question, they are both covered, and we're planning for them, and we can recognize in that planning that it presents some challenges, particularly given the restrictions of Proposition 2.5.
So do you get a feeling from talking with the constituents that they would support a 2.5 override, or is it mixed? What do you...
I would say right now, fairly mixed. I think for some people, they're sort of just beginning to think about it too, so they may not have landed somewhere yet. Because one of the things that has largely been true in Massachusetts is that we often see towns routinely passing 2.5 overrides, or trying to, year over year. Sometimes if you drive through some of our neighboring communities, we see those signs sort of routinely that Hamilton, Wenham, they're looking for 2.5 overrides. So in a town government style setting, people are often sort of accustomed to thinking about expecting it and thinking about what they think about it for the given plan. Cities frequently have a harder time passing overrides, and they get on the budget less frequently. I don't know that that's a reason for us not to think about one together, just given the challenges of our municipal finance situation right now. And I think one of the things that's good about having that conversation is it really does let voters have that conversation and think about the things that we value and where we want to prioritize our spending. I will say 2.5 overrides, and I think it's come up in Beverly a lot, thinking about the needs of our schools, which exist and are real. 2.5 overrides can also be prescribed to include some money for roads and sidewalks. So to my mind, we could think about a potential conversation where we're saying this amount would go to our schools and this amount to our infrastructure, which I think would be a broader conversation, potentially in a positive way.
Yeah. So the budget is sort of sorted out for this year. Next year, it's going to be surprisingly tight, and going forward. So we're in a situation where we've got to cut back somewhere.
Yes.
Or, as you said, it's an override. And Beverly's tried a couple of overrides in the past, and they have not been successful. So that's going to be a real challenge to produce it. And I think, again, it's not on your bailiwick, but the school committee is going to have to do a lot of work to sell the idea. Excuse me. The other thing that's concerning is there are very few offices on the city council or in the school committee being challenged. So what do you think of that as in terms of what's the interest on the taxpayers' part or the citizens' part about how the city is run?
I have the same concern as you, especially I think there are still some school committee seats currently not only uncontested, but a few I think where no one has pulled papers.
The first and second
The
ward.
first and second wards, yeah. And so I guess one of the things that I would say for folks in our community, if you have considered running for office, sometimes I think people hold back because they think, oh, I'm not sure I'm qualified, whatever that means, or I'm not sure that I have the experience. And I guess I would say that having more folks run for office is always a positive. It increases the conversation among both the incumbents and those running. It's good for the community in that way because it's really good for us to have the kind of conversations you and I are having happen more broadly when more people are running for office. Yeah. When incumbents are being challenged, maybe the incumbent then still retains their seat, or maybe not. Yeah. But really there is more conversation. There's community forums. So I would just say for folks, if you've considered running, if it sparks an interest in you, consider putting your name on the ballot and don't hold back, wondering if you're the right person or you have the experience, get out there and talk to your friends and neighbors and be part of the conversation. I think our community is better for it and will be better for it.
Well, now it's your turn to make your pitch for voting for Julie.
Thank you. So over the past terms that I've been part of the City Council, it truly has been, for the past 8 years, my honor and my privilege to get to represent you, to get to hear your stories, your concerns, your hopes, your ideas for our community, to work together to tackle, as George and I have talked about, some of these tough problems, both working together with you, the residents of our city, and with my fellow City Council colleagues, and with the administration, and trying to consider all of the ways that we can keep moving our community forward in the ways that we hope, setting the visions for what we hope our community can be. We know, as George and I were talking about, that this budget year and the ones to follow will be tighter than some of the ones that we have recently experienced. And while we're not alone in that, we need to grapple with that challenge for Beverly and to ensure that we continue to steward our resources, your resources, faithfully and the best that we can to continue to achieve the goals that we have in common, to support our schools, to support our educators, to support our infrastructure, to ensure that our public safety folks are able to be out there doing the job and safe while they're doing their jobs, to ensure that we're continuing to create a community where everyone can feel seen and valued and welcome and safe. These are all goals and priorities that we've set together. And so to be able to manage the resources at our disposal faithfully, responsibly, and well, I believe that we will be well served by having someone with experience and also a sense of optimism back on the City Council in one of the at-large councilor seats. And I believe that I bring that, both that experience, everything that I've learned along the way, but truly a sense of optimism that we can continue to untangle some of these hard knots together, that we can continue to move forward as a community and create in Beverly the kind of community we want to see over and over and over again. I also believe that I bring the experience that I've now had over 2 terms as a City Council president, really being able to think together with my colleagues about how the council can be most effective, not only in leading with things that we bring to the table in terms of our ideas and our hoped for changes, but also as a conversation partner and a good counterbalance to the office of mayor, whomever is in that office. So I would be honored to be able to go back to the City Council and represent you again, and honored to have your vote in November. Thank you. Thanks, George.
Well, thank you for coming, and I appreciate your comments. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And if you have any comments about the show, my email address is in the credits, so send me a note. And if you got a longer comment, there's room for you here at the table. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.